Hello, for those of you that are joining us. Welcome to our digital workshop today with Datamaran and Walgreens Boots Alliance. We're going to give it a minute for people to roll on in, and then we'll get the conversation started. I know people are rolling in as we speak, so we're just going to give it a couple of more minutes to let everyone settle in and grab a cup of coffee and get ready for the conversation. So those of you that just logged in, you have yet to miss anything. We're just waiting for people to roll in, settle in, and then we'll get the conversation started. Okay. Let's kick it off, and people will roll in as they come. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are calling in from. We're delighted that you are joining us today on Tuesday, May 14th. Today really is an interactive digital workshop where we're going to be hearing more from Walgreens Boots Alliance, the heads of ESG International, as well as here in the United States, about how they're leveraging technology to support their ESG strategy and ESG governance approach. Before we dive into the conversation, would love to just introduce ourselves. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Susanne Katus. I am SVP Market Leader at Datamaran. I have been with Datamaran since we started almost 10 years ago. Next month will be our 10-year anniversary. And in my capacity, I engage with our global network of clients really to help them leverage our technology and insights more strategically for governance type discussions. Hence us having the call today. But with me, the two stars of today, we have Neil Jones and Lauren Stone. So I will pass it off to Lauren to introduce herself.
Great. Thank you so much, Susie. And thank you so much to you and the whole Datamaran team for having us. We're really excited about the conversation today. My name is Lauren Stone. I'm Senior Director of ESG at Walgreens, and I'm also Interim Director of Community Affairs. So my team is very focused on everything from data collection to analysis to reporting. We work closely with our accounting team to ensure that we understand all regulations that pertain to our business and that we're prepared to meet those regulations. And my team also helps manage our assurance procedures around all of our global ESG reporting. And I work very closely with Neil Jones, so I'm going to pass it over to Neil to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, part of this event today. Really, I can just have the easy task of saying I do all of those functions and activities that Lauren's just described, but for Walgreens Boots Alliance outside of the US. So that means in 7 or 8 other countries, as diverse as Mexico, through here in the UK where I am, through to Germany, and even further afield in Thailand. So truly global operations that Lauren and I are responsible for under our titles of heads of ESG. Pleasure to be here. And Suzanne, you mentioned Datamaran's been going for 10 years. I think we've been working closely together for about 4 years now. So almost half of your lifespan as Datamaran. Yeah. We've come to know you very well, and I think you know us quite well.
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey. And I'm so glad that both of you can participate, which very much speaks to a key theme of today's discussion, which will really center around the idea of how do you establish a global framework as a company that can also adapt to local requirements. I think we're all in a position right now where we're feeling the tsunami of ESG regulations hitting us as companies. And so it's becoming a bit of a juggling act to try to understand how do we ensure consistency globally, but also align with local requirements. We'll dive more into that in a bit. But for now, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So for everyone's knowledge, this event is being recorded. We will share the recording with you once we've had a chance to compile that. If you do have technical difficulties while listening, please do email my wonderful colleagues at marketing@datamaran.com. And to keep the conversation dynamic, we are welcoming you to share any questions that you might have through the Q&A function. Just look at that sidebar. You can type those in. We may not get to them until the latter half of today, but we do want to keep this as dynamic as we can. So please ask questions as they come up. So for today, what we're going to be focusing on, as I'd mentioned, is really looking at WBA's journey and understanding how they've established a good governance structure that's able to align the different countries in which they operate in. So we'll focus that conversation there. We're going to talk about this idea of dynamic materiality. We'll then do a deep dive to showcase how you can support that type of ESG governance, that type of consistency globally with technology. And then we'll take some time to think about what's next, since there's certainly a lot of activity in this space. So just for some scene setting, we would love to better understand who's with us today. And so we have a few polls throughout the conversation. This is our first poll. And essentially it's a long one, but we want to better understand, where does your company stand on the maturity curve when it comes to ESG governance? And there are a few options there for you to select. Select the one that best fits. It might not be perfect, but essentially the different options are: A, you're not yet on that curve; B, you're at a very early stage starting to develop your ESG governance approach; C, intermediate, you have something in place, it's working, but there's definitely room for improvement; and D, advanced, it's robust, you could even be considered a leader setting industry standards. So we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to respond to that poll so we can better understand where you are on your journey. Okay, I see that we have some votes coming in. It looks like the majority of those are lining up to be intermediate. We do have some early stage. We have no votes yet for not yet on the curve. Good thing. And we have a few, 3 votes for advanced. Okay, great. Thank you all for sharing with us. That gives us a better feel of where you are so we can best cater the conversation today. And just before we dive in to hear more from Neil and from Lauren, just want to do some scene setting. So for those of you that may not be too familiar with Datamaran, you might be asking, why are we hosting this conversation? Datamaran is a AI-powered technology, a software that companies like WBA leverage really to support their ESG governance process. So when we look at the current ESG tech landscape, Datamaran really squarely sits in that ESG governance zone. And what do we mean by that? We mean it's about giving your companies the information they need to really feel confident about the issues that you're prioritizing, but also giving you good information to set your strategy around that, whether it be to understand which regulations are coming down the pike. What do reporting best practices look like? What's the public opinion on these different types of issues? And ultimately, companies leverage the platform really to be more productive and effective in the way that they develop their strategy around these issues. So, back in the day, I worked at Global Reporting Initiative. At that time, I think everyone felt the need to do everything. But we're moving towards a more sophisticated approach where there's a recognition you can't do everything. So how can you be more productive with your time, with your resources, and with ultimately your impact? Because that's why we're here. So this ESG governance process, I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of structure to that and what that looks like with the support of Datamaran technology. Ultimately, it's about having those ongoing conversations internally with the right leaders, those who are making decisions that will influence your strategy. So it's going through a more regular cadence of bringing good information up to support those conversations and ensuring that this is not just something that happens in a silo, but really, Lauren, as you said earlier, something that happens with the right disciplines at the table. And increasingly, we're seeing more disciplines joining that conversation with the likes of finance and accounting, as Lauren had mentioned. We're seeing that this idea of a more dynamic ESG governance process is now being codified in law. So CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive over in Europe, with ESRS standards being the foundation of that, we see that the ESRS standards are actually asking companies to disclose more information on how they're actually having these conversations, who's responsible for overseeing different ESG issues, how often they're looking at these issues. And then, of course, as part of CSRD, you have to update your reporting year over year. So essentially, you have to report on how your material issues have changed over time. CSRD is just one of the many regulations that we're seeing in this space. So in this graph, what you'll see here is essentially the total number of ESG regulations that we've seen over the past 10 years. The brown red line is looking at mandatory requirements, hard law, whereas the turquoise line is looking more at voluntary initiatives, standards, norms, things like TCFD. But ultimately, what this trend shows is that mandatory regulations are outpacing voluntary, and really there's exponential growth over time. And the key trend that we're seeing, which is something that we summarize in a policy brief, is really that these regulations are putting the spotlight on governance. Again, who's involved in overseeing these issues? What do those conversations look like? What information are you using to make your decisions? So that's why we're having the conversation today. So with that, Neil and Lauren, I'd love to unpack the WBA governance approach, because this is actually something that's taken from your latest corporate report. It's showcasing all of the different elements of your governance strategy. There is a lot here. So I would love to just unpack this with you and better understand what are some of the best practices, but also challenges that you've experienced.
Yeah, Susanne, thanks for that. Thanks for the intro, and some pretty stark views that you were just presenting there. The complicated nature of this landscape us ESG practitioners work in, the exponential growth of regulation as well. But if we think about ourselves here at Walgreens Boots Alliance, operating many pharmacies and stores as a business to consumer company, also involved in supply chain activities in terms of own brand products and sourcing from right throughout the world. That kind of context that we operate in as a business means we really do need to have strong governance and compliance structures in place. Lauren, you might want to comment on this in a moment, but from my perspective, I feel we're in a fortunate position because we have these structures in place for some time, probably upwards of 10 years now, that we've been inheriting in terms of Lauren and I being more recent into role. But we've just indicated as this page comes from our latest ESG report, 4 or 5 of the most key points. And I think that first arrow at the top is a nod to our double materiality assessment, which we carried out some 6 to 9 months ago now, very ably supported by you, Susanne, and the whole Datamaran team. And we might want to dive into exactly what that looks like. But really, the start of our scene setting, as I'm sure many people on this event are experiencing themselves, starts with that double materiality assessment. Lauren, I'll pass it off to you for any opening remarks you might have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. And I just want to double click on this idea of materiality as being truly foundational to all of your governance. So as Neil said, we have some really great governance processes in place already. We have an ESG executive committee that meets 4 times a year that we're reporting out to, and we have some kind of consistent topics that are always brought to that committee, which Datamaran does help us with quite a bit. So we'll get to talking about that. But your materiality assessment really helps your company understand internally what to prioritize, and how to integrate with business strategy. So it's really critical that materiality is a project where you are working cross-functionally, you're bringing leaders in, you're bringing external stakeholders in. And I think technology has a huge role to play to help streamline the process, particularly as CSRD is putting more requirements around how often you do these materiality assessments. So I think there's a huge opportunity for every company to use materiality to ground your company on what does ESG mean to you, how does it intersect with business strategy, and then how can you actually drive impact through your material topics.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the evolution of this idea of materiality, it's definitely accelerated with the concept of double materiality, which for those of you on the call, it sounds like you have awareness of what double materiality mean, but just to ensure everyone's on the same page, it's really about combining the perspective of financial and impact materiality, so the outside in and the inside out points of views. And from that standpoint, you mentioned, you do your materiality process, but you also meet with your governance committee 4 times a year. What are some of the standing agenda items that you bring to those governance committees to ensure that you are bringing people on this journey and enabling accountability across the organization?
Yeah, sure. Good question around that. A lot of it actually relates, Susanne, to the view you showed of the annual cycle on a slide 2 or 3 views ago about what we need to do with our steering committee during the course of a 12-month cycle. No single meeting is exactly the same as the last or the next. Maybe that's a nod to the dynamic nature of the subject matter, the projects that we're involved with, the partnerships that we're developing, both in the charitable space and with our suppliers as well. But aspects of activities that we would take to that committee would be examples such as policies and procedures, reviews of projects, and then, as Lauren was saying, for sure, the double materiality assessment is introduced to the committee so that committee feels like they're at the start of the process. They would then be involved in interviews and dialogue as we go through the double materiality assessment, and they would get the readout at the end as well. And then, as well as those topics, crucially, that the steering committee will review and sign off our annual ESG report to make sure that Lauren and I have been held to account on the amount of impact material we're putting into the public domain. And then, yeah, also setting annual objectives like your process was alluding to. So there's 4 or 5 examples. And last but not least, and maybe actually will start with the ESG landscape. We now have a standing item on the agenda, helped by the Datamaran team, looking to regulation, looking to what our peers are doing. So we're benchmarking, bringing rater and ranker scores to the committee's attention as well. So in fact, the more I think about it, a pretty varied agenda, meeting by meeting.
It is indeed. There's a lot to speak about. And, during our prep calls, we were just saying that the ESG discipline is so complex and so varied. And so as an ESG professional, there is a lot that you need to be on top of, and there is a lot that you need to bring to the table. How has technology helped you do your jobs better?
So I think it helps us stay on top of a lot of those regulatory and landscape pieces, and it's really helping us create consistent ways of communicating. So we're not saying that, we're going and doing Google searches to get this information. We're using tools like Datamaran that is able to access so much more data than we would ever be able to do manually, which when you're talking to people in the finance and the accounting community who are key stakeholders of ours, that's very meaningful to them. I think we've gone from a world where ESG is very much voluntary, and it's something that good companies did. People would look to it, but it was voluntary, to a space where it's very much mandatory. So helping the business understand that movement, and not just on a once a year basis, here's an update on ESG that you might be giving to your board, but doing more executive engagement on a regular basis. And again, using tools that are more robust than anything that you could do individually or manually is much more meaningful, and has really helped us get a lot of buy-in that I think we would have struggled with otherwise. I will say we are coming from a bit of an advantage because, as Neil alluded to, we have had some of these governance processes in place for far longer than Neil and I have been part of the business. So even when we were in this more voluntary space, we already had an ESG governance committee. We had executive engagement, but as we're continuing to push to utilize more tools to create more standardized processes and procedures, and particularly as we're seeing in regulations, requirements going from limited assurance to reasonable assurance, the controls are the most important piece. The governance is really what allows you to get there. And so using technology to ease that process so that you're not building systems yourself, which introduces human error, it just introduces more opportunity for things to go wrong. I think that has helped us better communicate with our executives in areas of the business that maybe weren't involved with ESG previously.
Yeah, it's about, having the process, which you mentioned, but also the information to help, either validate assumptions or build the business case. And, I think one of the questions that I'm often hearing is, how do we balance everything when we see that requirements are popping up across different countries? And you're a global company, you want to have systems in place. So you need something that's consistent to support a global framework. How are you two, in particular, just given your roles, how are you ensuring consistency in the way that you look at these issues, but also being on top of what's happening locally so you can meet those changing requirements and expectations at a regional or country level?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because you're absolutely right, Susanne. How do we bring some consistency to what we do across our global operations, but then also allow some flexibility so that market by market, country by country, can operate, with the material important topics that are relevant for them. So, there's a couple of points just to tease out, from the view on the screen at the moment. The double materiality assessment, started working with the Datamaran team to identify the global landscape of ESG topics. If we were exposed to all ESG topics, what would it look like? Actually that global view from Datamaran was super helpful as stage one of our where could we work on ESG if we chose to. So we're starting with that whole landscape. We then put that through the consumer lens. So fortunate at Walgreens Boots Alliance to have in-house consumer insight experts. So they were a big help. Commissioning views of consumers, that was naturally done across half a dozen different countries where we operate. And then the stakeholder view included interviews with our steering committee, other subject matter experts within our organization, and lots of external partners as well. So through that process of double materiality, absolutely identifying some common threads about where one topic applies everywhere for us, but then picking up the nuances, particularly through the consumer lens, as to where we should over index in one country or another. When you do all of that number crunching. We also worked with another third party who supported us extensively as well by way of project management. We then came out with a framework of, in our most recent iteration, 25 material topics that bind us together as a global organization. But then the annual framework that we review and put out to our network of ESG champions means that there's flexibility within that framework. So as long as the ESG champion is leading and responsible for a core number of activities, then they have flexibility within that framework, basically. I don't know, Lauren, from your perspective on the other side of the pond, how would you play that back?
Yeah, so from the US, what's interesting in our market is that we're dealing with regulations that vary state by state, municipality by municipality. So we're not necessarily, we're one country, but we still have variance within that country. And so again, using our materiality assessment as a foundation to really understand where we want to be having the greatest impact, where we want to be more ambitious with our target setting, and then layering on top what are the regulations that might impact the work that we do. That really helps us frame how we approach different regulations, because there are times where we may have a regulation that's in place for one state, but we decide that because of what the regulation is, it's going to be easier for us to implement procedures across the entirety of our US operations versus just doing things in that one state or just reporting in that one state. There are others, although I would say this is more rare for us as a business, where we are going to do things that are specific to a state or specific to a market. So what Datamaran and what materiality more generally helps us do is say, what's going to be relevant to us as a business? How can we prepare for these topics, particularly in spaces where we know regulations are in play? And then we already have plans and procedures in place for the most part to take action on regulation, many times even before those regulations become finalized. So we spend a lot of time, like I said, kind of doing scanning, horizon scanning, which we use Datamaran for. We work very closely with our government relations team to understand what are the different regulations that are in play, what are the conversations around those regulations, and how do we need to prepare ourselves. And then we'll frame that back into what are the topics that are material, where do we have the most impact, and where might we want to get ahead of things instead of kind of waiting for the regulation to hit.
Yeah, you brought up a really good point there, right? It's about having confidence in your strategy and the way that you've defined that strategy and the core areas that you're focusing on. So it's much more of a proactive engagement than something that is reactive, which, to what everything you've been speaking about has enabled you to grow, has enabled you to create that kind of consistency with flexibility as well. And I guess because, everyone's grappling with this, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you've had to overcome in order to create this type of framework where you can go out confidently and say, here's our strategy, here's the information to back up how we got there. Are there any key challenges that you've had to overcome and any best practices you would want to share with the group here?
I think from a best practice point of view, we've been fortunate that people have come towards this topic of ESG governance. As Lauren, you were saying, we're so ably supported and we work in lockstep with finance, legal, compliance, investor relations teams. So when we're actually forming the view of our eventual materiality matrix output, we would compile a group of knowledgeable folk who understand where these topics relate to their activities, and as well as that ESG champion network that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago as well. The challenge is that there's so much more, in my opinion, that we could be doing and should be doing as individuals and as teams, and sometimes you do have to draw a fine line, and some of our champions are juggling their maybe communications or HR or marketing roles, depending on where they sit in the organization. We're trying to grapple with this dynamic and diverse landscape of ESG. So there's some organizational challenges there, but the more we can do to unite I love your phrase, Susanne, but giving us some consistency and flexibility through, as is suggested on this view as well on screen, through our policies, our position statements. If there is some regulation, even legislation that works for us in one country, why not apply it across the whole of our WBA activities, and then we collect the data and have the structures in place for reporting out with it. So as much as we can integrate and apply globally, actually at the end of the day, works out better for us.
Great. And, to that point of keeping an eye on what's happening in the external landscape, there was a question from Brittany about how you're monitoring state-by-state regulations to layer on top of materiality. I know that's a big component of Datamaran for you. Is there anything you want to add on to there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the things that I am biased. I love governance and I love regulation, which I know is challenging for a lot of businesses. But one of the things that I think businesses should be looking at is how you can use regulation to your advantage. So are there areas where if you're a first mover and you're getting out ahead of a regulation, because it is a highly material topic for you, there's benefit to your business. So I know a lot of times in the ESG space, we like to say we're pre-competitive. I think we're all just trying to make the world a better place. But that being said, there are ways that you can utilize regulations to really push your business to become more ambitious. So if you can say there's a regulation that's coming down the pipeline, it's going to hit in 2029, we're in 2024 right now. This is the work that we've already done in this space because this is a highly material topic for us. This is what we're going to want to do in preparedness. This is how we're going to want to report on it. I think by framing regulation in that way and not framing it just as, well, we need to be compliant and here's our gap assessment and this is what we're going to do. And we'll make sure that at the time we need to be compliant, we are, but we're not going to do anything ahead of that time. I think that's one of the ways that we use materiality to help frame the conversation about these different state regulations. Again, as I was saying, for our company, just the way that we're set up, many times we are taking specific state regulations and we will apply them across the whole of the company. That is not always the case. So there are certainly times where we're only going to do things in markets where we need to. Sometimes it's because of cost or labor or the assets involved. But as much as possible, as Neil said, if we see a regulation, it's against a topic that we know is meaningful to our stakeholders, we are already taking action on it, and it's something that we can scale, we're going to build out the business case to see what it would look like to scale it, what the time frame would be, and then how we can really utilize that to our advantage.
Great. And that's a good transition point. We will actually showcase some of the capabilities of how you can monitor these regulations globally and locally. So Brittany, there will be more details shared soon. But before we go into actually walking through some real life examples that the WBA team is leveraging through the platform, we'd love to come back to the audience. We've talked a lot about this idea of horizon scanning. And monitoring the external landscape. There's a lot of activity, sometimes a lot of noise. So we'd love to hear from you where you sit or your company sits. So the second poll that we have for you is, on a scale of 1 to 4, rate your confidence level regarding your company's ability to track external ESG developments like regulation. You have options from 1 to 4. 1 is not confident at all, and 4 is extremely confident. Those options should be popping up for you. So if you could just share with us your own confidence level. And we'll give you about 30 seconds there. All right, it looks like so far most of the votes are moderately confident, confident. There are some that have said not confident at all. Only a couple who are extremely confident, which is great to hear. Okay. So it looks like majority have landed on the moderately confident side, on number 2 on the scale of 1 to 4, which makes sense. There's a lot of activity happening, and it's sort of an emerging landscape. So we're going to now transition, as I mentioned, into some live examples. We've been doing a lot of talking. We'd love to do a little showing to see how the technology is being used by WBA. So I'm going to move on. We talked a lot about this idea of materiality and double materiality. So ultimately, as we're seeing now with CSRD, there are essentially 4 pillars that are really critical to what Neil and Lauren have been talking about in terms of just taking a smarter approach, having good governance structures. And those 4 pillars are double materiality, being able to set realistic goals around your core issues, being able to set a solid strategy. Lauren, you talked about this. I know that WBA has always put a lot of attention to assurance as well, but now that's also become a legal requirement to go through an external assurance process. And then we've talked a lot about monitoring. So for purposes of the live walkthrough today, we're really going to focus on this step of monitoring. Steps 1, 2, and 3 were covered quite sufficiently in another workshop we hosted a couple of months ago. We will share that link with you if you are interested in doing a deeper dive into those 3 steps to see how technology can help you there. But for purposes of today, we'll focus in on the monitoring component here. And again, with the idea that these 4 pillars are really about having a stronger ESG governance process. So I'm just going to toggle my screen over here. And again, we're not going to spend too much time here, but just to give you an idea of what this actually looks like in practice. So as well, disclaimer, what I'm showing is not WBA specific. This is just for demonstration purposes, looking at an example from the perspective of a consumer health company. All of the insights, external insights are real, but anything representing my company is just for demo purposes. And so thinking about those 4 pillars, let's start from the basis of we've gone through the process of double materiality. We know what's important to us as a company. How are we going to keep on top of these issues? How are we going to have that consistent pulse check, as Lauren was talking about, to support those governance conversations? Here's the output that helps to visualize what are material issues for the company. We're focusing now on a global scope, but as you can see here, there are ways that you can modify this to take country or regionally specific scopes, something that I know WBA has done with the platform as well. And essentially, now that we know what's important to our company, the question is, let's keep an eye on how these issues evolve over time. And doing that manually can be really time consuming. I think, Lauren, when we were talking about this, you said you would need an army of analysts, which just is not realistic given, the reality of team sizes, talent out there, cost. So in this example, we'll show how quickly you can get those types of pulse checks. Essentially, we've gone through the process of knowing what's important, and now we're going to compare over just a month period how issues may have evolved over time. What we can do is not only understand which issues are changing in importance over time, you can really understand what's driving that change. So it's not just about hearing something at a conference or getting a newsletter or reading a news article. It's really about seeing from a more holistic perspective, how are different external developments like regulation, like policymaking, like peer reporting, like media influencing the importance of these issues over time. And in this case, since we've been talking a lot about regulation, I know there are some questions there. The key question is, what's driving that change from a regulatory perspective? Just zooming over to my other screen. We can see that from a regulatory standpoint, this is a hard law standpoint. Ultimately, there are certain topics that have already changed in importance over just that 1 month period. And if we click in here and look at climate change, what we're able to see is what's actually driven that change? Where is this regulation taking place? Are these proposed regulations? Do these regulations have sanctions? And this is giving you that top level overview, again, looking from the perspective of a global company. But then let's say you want to dive in deeper and really understand what are those specific regulations. This is where you can go that layer down. So there was a question earlier about how do you keep an eye on state level? If this were a US specific analysis, you would get specific state level initiatives included in this point of view. And then, to go even a layer down, I know this is Danish, not a US state. You can click in to get a deeper dive to understand what's happening here. How are we going to actually approach something like this? I'm just going to pause there. Neil, Lauren, I know I kind of brushed through that cadence, but if you want to maybe just shed some light on now that you have this information, how do you share this with individuals internally?
Yeah, sure. One way is, across our ESG community is to regularly converse on this. It's to check our understanding with not just the Datamaran team, but other external partners that we might call critical friends, accounting firms, etc. So, organizationally, we have a real super user of the Datamaran platform, a great guy called Kevin, who keeps his finger on the pulse of what's going on here. So we're reviewing it on a regular basis in conjunction with the policy brief documents that are more narrative, which is super helpful for us, and then on a quarterly basis tie that together for that kind of landscape review that we talked about at the beginning of this session, reporting into our steerco. So that's how I see us doing using the information. Does that chime with you, Lauren?
Yeah, I was going to say the only other thing is, because we've been doing materiality assessments specifically for quite some time, there is a lot of interest within our business when we do materiality assessments to understand the outcomes by many of our executives. So as Neil had spoken to earlier, we definitely share those results specifically with our ESG committee, and our board gets access to them as well. But we do as much as we can to socialize results specifically from materiality across the business with key groups that we work with to make sure that there is really good alignment internally. So I think, as Neil said, we're kind of keeping our finger on the pulse of all of these changes, how regulatory is impacting the work that we do, things like that gets framed on a quarterly basis to our ESG committee. But for materiality specifically, we do a big push around socializing those results as soon as they're agreed on and approved, because again, that really does set the foundation for your business on what are their priorities, where are you going to set goals, things like that.
Yeah. And I think to your point, socializing the information is important. I know a lot of times these trends insights are used as well, the visualizations. And there was a question that popped up specifically related to this about the notify me function. I realize I went over that, but essentially going back to, if you're into a specific regulation and you want to keep an eye on how this evolves over time, because as we can see, this is a proposed regulation. We are tracking the life cycle here. What you can do is click notify me. So rather than having to go into the platform to get these updates, what then happens is you'll receive alerts that will give you this information. And those are alerts that you can set on a specific regulatory level, but you can also set it, for instance, I want to keep an eye on all climate related regulations globally, or all plastics related regulations in APAC. So different ways you can play with that. Neil, you had mentioned as well the policy brief. So there's a lot of information in the platform, but also this is the policy brief that you had mentioned earlier. And, I think I wanted to show this just because this is the one from last quarter. So these are produced every quarter to summarize as concisely as possible, although that's becoming challenging, what's happening out there from a regulatory standpoint. And, if you just look at the table of contents here, you'll see that there is so much activity worldwide. So, rightfully so, the EU is getting a lot of attention with CSRD, CSDDD. But really, this is a global evolution. I know for a lot of companies, keeping an eye on how CSRD is transposed into local law is really important. So we have created a specific CSRD transposition tracking, and that's part of the policy brief as well. So this will just keep you up to date as to how that directive is actually being transposed as local law within the different countries. All right. So I know that was quite a quick run through there. One of the things that I'm seeing in terms of questions here from the Q&A that we have are related a lot to the monitoring in particular, thinking about, who to partner with on this, how much expert, let's see. Okay. I'm just reading through the questions. So here we go. This is a question that goes a little bit deeper into a particular topic of how much expert qualification and definition are you needing to do to define the actual or potential impacts and company-specific risks and opportunities when you go through that materiality process. This is going a little bit deeper. Neil, I'm wondering if you wanted to take that, and Lauren, if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, sure. I can start with that maybe. Thanks for the question. I think up until now, having done 3 iterations of a materiality assessment on a 2 or 3 yearly cycle, means that we are scanning the environment. But in terms of how deep we go, I'm super conscious that there is greater expectation coming over the horizon. The more I read about CSRD and the need to quantify, the impacts, the risk, the opportunities, to be honest, means our next iteration, when we next refresh our double materiality, that's something I personally will need to look more into. So we're quantifying more rather than a bit more subjective, which I think many materiality assessments have probably been up to this point. So in addition to doing materiality, we've also completed 1 iteration of a climate scenario analysis project, again with a different third party, but that has encouraged us to think about that quantification, putting metrics on the risks of climate change, but also the opportunities for us as a healthcare organization to some extent. So we've done it to some extent on climate, but I think the more we refresh materiality, the more it's going to be stretching to actually put some quantification to it. That would be my take. So more for us to do in the future.
I think the only thing I would add to that is we did work with a small group of internal experts to help us frame some of these topics. As Neil said, not going all the way to fully quantifying, but definitely asking the different components of risks and opportunities. I think as we move forward, we'll be doing a lot more of that and really working with our internal experts, because even on those annual refreshes, you can use Datamaran and then bring that to your internal experts to have them opine on what you're seeing to make sure that it is aligned. And I think it's creating that network internally of people who really understand these topics, understand the company and the business strategy, and can bring that lens to this work.
Yeah, and Lauren, you had mentioned something there too. I know beyond the regulatory insights that you capture from Datamaran, you've used some of the benchmarking insights. So, I think to your point, a starting point for a lot of companies is how are other companies framing this issue as a risk or opportunity? And so just to shed a little light on the insights that you can gather there, once you know that a topic is material, you might want to see, within a financial report, a 10K report from US listed companies, what's their positioning, what's their disclosure, how are they actually framing this particular topic as a risk or opportunity, and what are the types of impacts that they may be disclosing as well in relation to those topics. So Datamaran, what you're seeing now is it's doing all of that crunching for you. So you don't actually have to read through a report yourself to get that type of intelligence, but it will actually point you to the areas that are most important. So here you could see, essentially these are suggested risks and opportunities in the context of climate change, looking at financial disclosures from other companies in your industry. And so you can see how specifically they frame that as a risk or as an opportunity, and whether or not that's something core to operations or considered across the value stream, downstream, upstream. And you can go into the specific reports to see where that reference is actually made within those financial reports. So it seems like there have been a lot of questions around double materiality, rightfully so. But that actually gets us to one of the last polling question that we have for the audience. And that is whether or not your company is implementing a double materiality process. So we would love to hear from you. We have a few responses that you can provide. So A, yes, we've completed our first double materiality assessment, first or more. Perhaps you've already done it more than once. Phew, you can take a break. B, we're just getting started. Yikes. C, we're planning on it. Help. And D, no, we're not planning on it, at least for now. So we'll give everyone a moment there. Based on the questions that are being asked, Neil and Lauren, though, it seems like a lot of people have double materiality top of mind.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me given what ESG practitioners are having to face into, and those external dynamics going on. But also to that point, just while you're collecting the poll results, Susanne, I think ESG roles can be quite niche within an organization. We're fortunate to have lots of subject matter experts in our company, but I think there's a couple of questions and remarks about where else do you look for support. Genuinely, I see the Datamaran team as an extension to our in-house team with the horizon scanning and the proactive nature of your organization. So just a big thank you to the Datamaran team for your support. But naturally, as people on the call will recognize, lots of kind of industry networks, supply chain opportunities, so you don't have to always go out on a limb yourself. Us ESG folk are often willing to help and support, I find.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I think we all continue in this industry is because of that collaboration and dynamic nature of the work. And it's been quite humbling experience to be able to work with your team as well on this and see the progress that you've made. Okay, so where have we landed in terms of where the audience is? There's quite a few that have completed their first. There's a larger group that's just getting started, a few that are planning on it, and then some that are not planning on it, at least for now, but that's a small minority there. Okay, so I think really we've clarified what is the role of materiality when it comes to governance, which I think in itself just helps to reinforce that materiality is no longer this static project that you dedicate, exclusively 3 to 12 months of efforts to, but it is something that needs to be dynamic. And if you leverage that process and the information, this can really help you create consistency globally in how you think about your ESG issues. We've got a few minutes remaining, and I'd love to just come back to this visualization to sort of end on this note and ask the audience, please respond, put your responses in the Q&A, but Neil and Lauren in particular, what do you see as the future of corporate ESG governance?
I think the future is in collaboration. Governance is not something that any one team can do itself. So while I think it's important for ESG teams to come in with thoughts about structure, and what teams need to be involved. I think for us, at least, it was working even more closely with our assurance partner and getting a lot of insight from them on what are their expectations and how can we help set ourselves up for the future. It was working very closely with our accounting team and our SEC experts and understanding from them, how can we utilize resources already existing within our business and apply them to non-financial data. And it's using tools like Datamaran to be able to continue to stay on top of the trends, understand what our peers are doing, understand what materiality looks like for us. One of the things that I think is important to note is if you do a materiality assessment well, you shouldn't see major shifts every time you do it. So it shouldn't be that, Neil mentioned we have 25 material topics. We've done several materiality assessments at this point. And while we're sometimes introducing a new topic, or we'll merge topics sometimes, or topics will drop off, and certainly CSRD and certain topics that they expect to see on there have helped introduce some new things. But it's not like we're seeing a materiality assessment that is significantly different from previous ones. And I think if you're getting insight from a broad array of stakeholders, it should give you a good sense of where you should be focused. So I think some of the future of ESG is on how do you tailor a materiality approach and a trend spotting approach that works for your business and your sector and your organization and the markets where you're active. Because if you put a good process in place initially, it should actually hold pretty well over the course of many years. And I think with ESG, we're looking in the short term, 3 to 5 years, but in the long term, we're looking 20 years down the road and helping our businesses be sustainable for those longer term periods of time. You can't do that if every year, every 2 years, you're changing your strategy completely. So it's creating a collaborative space with experts in your organization to help create sustainable strategies over the long term.
Yeah, Susanne, I would echo all of that. And just briefly, as well as collaboration, anything to cut through the complexity of a more complicated world, it strikes me, is what we should aim for. So Datamaran helps us to cut through that complexity. Our trusted partners that we rely on right across our 25 material topics help us to cut through that complexity. If we can make governance more efficient, it frees up more time for thinking about the art of the possible, pushing the boundaries, and ultimately demonstrating the impact on some really key challenges for us as a company and society. So thank you for your help, Datamaran, in helping us to cut through that complexity.
Absolutely. That is our end goal. And with that, I think we'll end there. I know that there are some questions in the Q&A that weren't answered live. We will respond to those questions to you over email. We just ran out of time. So thank you so much to the audience too for listening in, joining us for today, engaging with us and sharing your thoughts. You'll be hearing from us soon with the recording and some of the materials that were referenced in this conversation as well. But big thanks to Neil and Lauren in particular for not just joining us today, but the important work that you are doing at WBA to really have a good impact.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.